Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Chappell. Welcome to this presentation. In the 29 years I've been in practice, I've had the absolute pleasure of being able to serve thousands of practice members and their families and children to reach higher states of health and function over time. And during this time, with that experience with these practice members, we found that there's a lot of little things that people are just unaware of that can make a huge difference, particularly in children's learning potential during their earlier years and as they set up patterns of behavior that carry on throughout their life. So that's what we want to talk about today, is empowering your child's early learning potential so that they can have a potential to reach higher states of function and expression within these realms. So the thing we need to start with is to understand we need to start to think out of the box, because learning is not just brain-based. It's basically a combination of a full body response, and they call it the mind-body connection. It's not just about the brain, but they're finding big neural connections now between the heart and the brain, how they communicate back and forth, the skeletal system and how it fires information when it's moving correctly, fires information into the brain, upregulating different learning and memory centers. And also the gut, your intestines and your large intestine and small intestines, is that basically, with the research now with autistic and kids on the spectrum, is that they're finding that there's a lot of information going on in the processing within the gut. And all of these different centers talk to each other. So we need to open these neural connections so that they can do that in a much higher level. So early programming is where I'd like to start. And it's interesting, in the birth to about the age of 6, we're in what they call the hypnagogic stage, and we're basically just little sponges, and we're absorbing everything that's going on in our environment. What's going on with our family, parents, extended family, and their friends, how they think, how they act, their posture, what they eat, and how they share emotions and express those emotions and so forth. So we're basically picking these different things up that I'm going to go through here, and they form what reality is out there and how we should be as human beings and set up these patterns of behavior. And we also have all the life experiences. How many things are you subjecting these kids to that open up different ways of thinking and looking at the world that we live in? And the books and media they're subjected to, authoritative figures, teachers, clergy people, and other important figures within our community that they have exposure to. And then we have TV, radio, and computer games, which is really scary because of all the negative and information, the violence and so forth that's out there. I mean, even if a kid is over playing in a corner with his own toys and the parents are over on the other end of the room or in the next room with a violent video game, that child is actually picking that up according to different psychologist studies, and saying that the kids are picking those up is that what's happening out there in reality, and it's setting up patterns of how they're setting themselves up on a cellular level to actually respond to those later on. So we have to take a look at the environmental exposure and be aware of these things so we can start to have some input and control over them so that they don't have a negative influence on these kids over time. And understanding that we have a certain potential that we can realize, but that potential is not always expressed. So it's really the expression is really the key to this whole thing. So potential is not either on or off, and the kids have the potential or they don't have the potential. It's the expression of it again. It's not like a light switch that's on or off. It's like a dimmer switch. It's either turned up or turned down depending on the different things that kids are associated with during their lives and how they go through this process. So that's what we want to cover today, is go through some tips and strategies for you to help you be able to ramp up that expression to more of the full potential. So it's all about neural networks. We have these potential of neural networks that we can expand into over time. So how well are we actually doing that? Because of all these different things that the kids are exposed to, not only in schools but home, and they're just basic life experiences and so forth, as we talked about a few minutes ago, they cause these neural networks to gain connections, and they start to expand within the body, raising us higher and higher into what our full potential is. And the key to this is that if these neural networks are not stimulated, we basically prune them off over time during our teenage years. So we want to try to expand those as much as we can so that we have more of a basis for understanding, learning, and memory and so forth throughout our entire life. So what inhibits learning? What is it that keeps us from expanding into these vast neural networks? And we're going to go over all of this in more detail in just a few minutes, but let's just give a quick overview. Is decreased stimulation and touch, particularly when we're infants. And that relates to movement. As we get older and we start to move ourselves, we have to be able to move, but make sure we're moving correctly. And then we have unhealthy nutrition, increased stress, candida overgrowth, which is a yeast overgrowth, so I'll get into that in a few minutes, and also direct interferences into those neural connections. So let's start with movement. They say that movement is a nutrient to the brain. If you look at a metaphor for this, in your car you have a battery, and that battery is what allows the car to run, and it also feeds the energy into the electronics so that you can have navigation and lights and radio and your iPod being able to play and so forth. So that battery, if it doesn't have any input to it, will slowly get drained out and eventually go dead. So what it needs is the alternator. The car gets started, it runs the alternator generates electricity, feeds the battery, and keeps the battery charged up. So as different things are using the energy from the battery, it's constantly charged. Well, if you think about the human brain and body, when I was in school 29, 30 years ago, we were basically told that the brain was like a computer, and it just sent information down, told things what to do, and then monitored information up, and then made changes accordingly and adapted to different things. But now they say it actually works exactly opposite that the brain doesn't do anything unless it gets stimulated from the body. And what do you think, where do you think that basic stimulation comes from? I know hardly anybody really ever knows this because most of us were never told, but it comes from spinal motion. How important motion of the body is to send the signals up, to charge the brain up, so all these different brain centers can communicate with each other to then integrate function down into the body. Well, all your different vital organs and systems, your muscle system to move you and so forth, move you appropriately. So we need the spinal motion. The importance of this is illustrated by Dr. Roger Sperry. He was a Nobel Prize recipient for brain research. He says that 90% of the stimulation and nutrition to the brain is from the spine. And when I was in my wellness certification, we studied this very complicated diagram about how different areas of the spine, when they are moving correctly and they're firing the good signals up into the different areas of the brain, how they upregulate those different areas, just like charging the battery up. We charge the brain up to then be able to tell the body how to do its job the way it's supposed to and be in an optimum state of what's called homeostasis or health. When it's not functioning correctly, it fires a different signal that interferes with proper function. And this is very complicated diagram, so let's simplify it a little bit. And when we show this, how these mechanoreceptors in the spine, when it's moving properly, have enough motion and it's moving correctly, it fires these signals up into the brain, upregulates these different brain centers. And look at this, it has the hormone centers, the stress and anxiety control centers, learning centers in the hippocampus, the cerebellum, thoughts, memory, emotions, learning, and stress reactions. So this is really important to make sure that we get enough motion and it's moving correctly. So what happens is, or what the problem is nowadays, is that we're just not moving enough. And when I was a kid, God, we came home from school, the backpack came off and we were playing and just running and moving until time for dinner. And nowadays the kids have way too much what's called screen time, and that's sitting on a computer, on playing video games, texting, on the your different mobile devices to check email and so forth. So it really causes a problem, because when these mechanoreceptors are not moving correctly, or they're not moving at all, what happens is different signals called nociception fire back up into the brain. They start to interfere with some of these centers. And one of the big problems with this is that it also fires down into the pituitary and down into the adrenal glands, stimulates the adrenal glands to higher and higher levels. And your adrenal glands are your stress hormone glands. So when they start to release more and more of their stress hormones, like catecholamines, in particular cortisol, they can be very catabolic to the system over time. And when I mean catabolic, it means it can cause more and more breakdowns in the system. You see, our stress response is really designed to be very kind of periodic and episodic. It should happen, and then we don't have a big stress for a few days, and then things start to settle down. The body clears these chemicals because they're very good in the short run, but very detrimental in the long run. And how often do we experience stress reactions in our lives? Almost every day. So we're already releasing a lot of stress hormones in there. What we don't need is an overlay of these improper signals coming back down into the adrenal area. And then we start to move into the nutritional aspects. And nutrition is really a fuel for the brain. You have to give it what it needs and remove what harms it. And when we start to think about nutrition, we need to think about how we are genetically programmed to process food. We look back at our ancestors, and they say that we've been probably genetically programmed to process foods in a certain way for over like 40,000 years. And what did those people eat? They eat vegetables, fruits, berries, nuts, seeds, wild game, fish, fowl, that type of thing, and basically that was it. And so that's what we're genetically programmed to put into our body and use to process our different functions. So when we take a look at, particularly for the brain, what we need are good protein sources, essential fatty acids, omega-3s. We get a lot of omega-6s and omega-9s, these other fatty acids in the typical American diet, but we get very little of the omega-3s. And then we want good complex carbohydrates. Unfortunately, most of what we consume nowadays is more into the refined carbohydrate. We remove all of the good stuff that the brain really needs, like B vitamins and so forth. Then we look at protein sources. They should be like meat, fish, fowl. Eggs is a really good quality protein. The old stigma about cholesterol with eggs and so forth has really been debunked. So my book that's coming out in a couple of months is going to have more information on that. So look for that. Prudent dairy, nuts, and legumes, which are beans. Then we look at those omega-3 sources, and with cold water fish, the one issue with that nowadays is the fact that there are so many toxins in our water and our oceans that the smaller fish get the toxins, the PCBs and the mercury and so forth, that get on the bottom. They get that into their food chain, and then the bigger fish eat them, and the bigger fish eat them. So it bioaccumulates up to the larger fish, like the salmon, tuna, and cod that we typically consume. And they have a lot of omega-3s in them, but when they express out the oil, or we eat the fish themselves, these toxins are stored in the oil. So, or in their fat, I mean. And so what we need to do is just kind of hold these fish sources down to a minimum. What's better is to really do a supplementation for omega-3s. And when I say molecularly distilled supplements, the reason for that is that if they express out take that fat and express the oil out of it, and the toxins are in there, you're getting the good with the bad. So you really need to make sure you get a really good quality omega-3 that's molecularly distilled to get out all of the toxins and all the junk out of it. Olive oil, flax seeds, walnuts, and enriched eggs, where they feed the chicken things like flax seeds and so forth, so the omegas get into the eggs, and then you get those when you eat them. It's interesting, Purdue did a study and said that kids that are low in omega-3 fatty acids have significantly more problems with behavior and learning disorders and so forth. So you look at kids with ADD, ADHD, and hyperactivity and so forth, you need to make sure you're getting them a good quality omega-3. It'll really help to get their system settled down. And in the years I've been in practice, I've seen a lot of kids. You get them adjusted to settle get the interference out of the nervous system that we'll talk about in a few minutes, get them onto omega-3s and get the sugars and the other preservatives and other excitotoxins out of their diet. It's huge. You can see real significant changes in them. So then we look at the complex carbohydrates, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, seeds, nuts, legumes, things like that. And basically, the reason that I'm saying limited insofar as whole grains, remember a minute ago I said that we've been genetically programmed over about 40,000 years? Well, we've only been an agrarian society for about 6,000 of those years, which sounds like a long time, but it's very short insofar as the evolutionary time scale. So what's happened is our bodies aren't really well set up to process a lot of grains. And also with grains, particularly wheat, you get the gluten issues. It's a big thing now insofar as helping people working through different breakdowns in their system. And the other thing you have to consider is that thanks to Monsanto, we have a lot of things that are being genetically modified into these grains that keep them to be resistant to Roundup, and it's called glyphosate, and it's very toxic to the system. You can't wash it off and get rid of it because it's actually in the grains. So grains can be a little bit of an issue, so keep them to a minimum. You know, the thing is, when you take a look at all the foods that we typically eat nowadays, these are really not food. They're industrialized products. And so they can cause, there are things added to them in the process that can really be very detrimental to the human system and particularly to the brain. So looking at the downside of some of these foods, we can think like sugar. I mean, sugar has a huge list of ill effects on the body. And insofar as our discussion today, these kids have to be energetic and focused and healthy to be able to sit there and go through and be able to learn and have the proper resources for memory and so forth. So we look at things like depression, immune system suppression. I mean, if we're sick, we can't sit there and be focused. Fatigue, decreased energy, and yeast infections, which we'll get into in a few minutes. So then, and we look at high fructose corn syrup, and it's literally in everything that we eat nowadays. I mean, the list is huge when you really start to take a look at how these things are hidden in our foods, and just looks down through this list of the hidden sugars of things very common. I mean, things like salad dressings, tomato sauce, processed cheeses, and so forth. And some of your condiments that you use have high fructose corn syrup. So we're getting dosed with high fructose corn syrup on a regular basis if we're not paying attention to what we're eating. And then we have the artificial sweeteners like Splenda and NutraSweet. Interesting with aspartame, which is NutraSweet, is that I had a lady come in and she was drinking something like 2 32-ounce Diet Cokes a day, and she was very obese. And so we started working with her and changing that. We got her to stop drinking the pop, drinking primarily water. Things were going along great. She was starting to lose weight, and then all of a sudden her legs started swelling up, couldn't breathe, having a hard time sleep at night. She wound up in a walker. They were getting ready to do exploratory surgery, and when we started taking a look at it, it wound up, I said, so you know, what are you drinking? She said, well, I got tired of the water, so I needed to have something with some flavor in it, so I went to Crystal Light. And the problem with Crystal Light is that it has aspartame in it, and she was having mints and chewing gum with aspartame. So she was getting what was called aspartame poisoning. And when we got her off of all of those products, basically within 2 weeks, her system had totally reversed. The swelling came down, she could breathe and sleep and so forth, and she got back to her normal state of health. So that's a NutraSweet. And when we look at sucralose or Splenda, they did a great job when they first started advertising this and saying, oh, it's natural because it's from a sugar molecule. But the problem is anytime you start altering stuff, it's not natural anymore. That's why they can't run those ads, because it's false advertising. Is that basically what they were doing with the sugar was adding a chlorine onto it to make it super sweet, and when they did that, those form compounds or chlorocarbons, which are very neurotoxic to the system and can damage the brain and the nervous system along with the liver. So they can have a very detrimental effect on your child's health and nervous system function. What are the good sweeteners? Stevia is really good. It's just as sweet as the artificial sweeteners, but it comes from a plant, an herb, so it's there's no downside to it. It's very healthy. Then you have raw honey, maple syrup, molasses, organic cane sugar. We used to actually have agave nectar in there in our list, but when more and more they're finding agave nectar isn't too far away from high fructose corn syrup and how the body processes it, so I've literally taken it off my list. Excitotoxins is another big one, and excitotoxins are substances they put into food to fool your brain chemically to make it think that it's tasting better. It's interesting, years ago when I was doing I was researching some weight loss programs for patients, and when I started looking at the ingredients in some of these things, people were losing a lot of weight on this particular program I was looking at. But when I took a look at the ingredients, everything that was sweetened had artificial sweeteners in it, had Splenda in it, and everything that was non-sweetened had excitotoxins. And excitotoxins are very neurotoxic to the system. Dr. Russell Blaylock, who wrote this book, Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills, board-certified neurosurgeon, very down on these products and how detrimental they can be to the body over time. So one of the things that's very common to see with excitotoxins is MSG, monosodium glutamate. And I think all of us are pretty well familiar with that it's not really good to put it into the body on a long period, on a regular basis. So a lot of the manufacturers realized people stopped buying those products, so they changed the formulations, and now what you'll see is these derivatives of MSG like yeast extract, hydrolyzed protein, hydrolyzed soy protein, natural flavor, textured protein, things like this. they are basically very similar to MSG, except they change them. A lot of people just don't recognize what they are. When I tell people to go start looking at the labels, they're just amazed at how many products they are actually consuming that have these things in them. If you want a larger list of these, there are like 25 different things. You can go to our website, chappellhealth.com, put MSG in the search bar, and it'll pull up a post that I did with a list of these different additives. So you want to read your labels. You really want to get these things out of your kids' diet because they harm the system over time. And again, as we started out, you want to give what helps and remove what harms. So give them the good food because healthy, smart brains love healthy food, okay? And so you want to get the good stuff in there and remove the bad as much as you possibly can. And it doesn't mean that you have to be perfect. It's just about trying to reduce the stress demands and loads on the body as much as we possibly can. Now, Candida albicans. Our body has what's called a microbiome in our gut, and it's a lot of the good bacteria that are in there that are designed for very specific physiological processes. In fact, Scientific American magazine a couple of years ago had this great article called Your Inner Ecosystem, and what they talked about in there was there are about 10 times more bacterial cells than there are actual cells that make up the physical structure of the body. So it's huge, and these are good bacteria. They're designed to be there for proper function. What's the problem with that is that over time antibiotics do what? They kill off the bacteria. They not only kill off the bad bacteria, but they also kill off the good bacteria. And those antibiotics can come in two forms. They can be from therapeutic doses that we take, even back when we're kids and so forth, and also through our food sources. Things like meat and chicken that are not what we call clean meat. They're not antibiotic and hormone free. You really need to check your sources in the grocery store or go to the health food store and find good clean meat sources, or ones that are free ranged and not given these antibiotics and hormones in their feed system. Because they dose you literally on a daily basis if you're eating meat on a chicken every day. So antibiotics kill off the good bacteria. What's the problem with that? And that the relevance to what we're talking about is that when they kill off the good bacteria, what happens is the yeast, the candida, and the bacteria need to live in harmony. And when the antibiotics kill off the good bacteria, now the yeast go into overgrowth, and they can actually go through the cell walls, and particularly if we have what's called leaky gut syndrome, which a lot of people do because a lot of the things that we've been eating have a detrimental effect on the walls of our intestines, so they make larger holes that the substances can go through and get in our bloodstream. So the candida goes right in, it goes systemic, and it can cause a host of problems. We call it the Great Masquerader because, I mean, just look at some of these things you go down through here insofar as what it can cause. And again, relevant to our conversation here, reoccurring and non-responsive infections. Well, what happens when you have an infection? You go to the medical doctor. If they don't actually culture what you've got going on, they may think it's just another bacterial infection, and what do they give you? More antibiotics. So what it is, now we start to kill off more and more of the good bacteria, so it's a downward spiral over time. Yeast can cause fatigue and weight gain, impaired learning ability, irritability, memory loss, hyperactivity, foggy thinking. I mean, it's huge insofar as these kids' ability to try to absorb and assimilate information. So what's our solution? Well, obviously, we want to build the bacteria back up and reduce the yeast impact on our systems. How do we do that? We need to re-inoculate the system with a really good broad spectrum bacteria. In our office, we got a great 2-week program that we go through, put people on a 2-week diet that's designed to kill off the yeast, because besides improving the bacteria, we need to get rid of the yeast overgrowth. So we have them on a diet for 2 weeks that creates an environment in the body. We don't feed the yeast, and then we also give them a supplement that creates an environment in the system that they can't live in. So they're not drugs, but they're basically herbs and different substances that create, again, this chemical environment in the body that the yeast can't live in. So we start to kill off the yeast because we're creating the environment and not feeding them, and then we're re-inoculating with a really good broad spectrum bacteria. And the reason I'm saying good broad spectrum is because a lot of people take Acidophilus and Bifidus, but that's not a broad spectrum. That's 2 of the bacteria out of literally hundreds. So you want to get a really good combination of these. And obviously, if you haven't been on antibiotics yet, or you want to try to prevent them and having to take them again in the future, what's the clue to that is improve your resistance to get healthier so you don't get sick in the first place and have to go and possibly take antibiotics. So true prevention. Okay. Then we start to move into stress. And I think all of us have, I mean, you look at the stress we're under nowadays, it's huge. Not only what's going on in our own lives, but also in the lives outside of us in our crazy world. And we're having to react to these different things and seeing how they impact us as human beings. And we look at the kids and how are they picking these things up. So what are the stress effects? As we talked about, they can start in the womb. The psychologists, again, have done studies where they've been able to monitor the fetus while the mother and father go through a improvised argument to see how it affects the child, and they can see distress with the child or in the fetus itself. Then we have these chronically elevated adrenaline, and particularly the cortisol we talked about a few minutes ago, can kill neurons in the brain that have a significant negative effect on learning and memory. And then we look at increased survival modes. You know, when we're in this fight or flight stress reaction, which again should happen only periodically, but it happens every day with us nowadays, is that when we're in these chronically elevated stress reactions, we don't need critical thinking. The body goes into a process of just being short-term, trying to fight or flight and deal with things. So again, it can affect reasoning and thought, motor control, inner self, speech, and so forth, self-control. Again, with these kids that are in a lot of stress, it's hard for them to control their behavior. So with, again, hyperactivity and ADD, ADHD type of situations. So we have three categories of stressors, and the primary thing that people look at insofar as stress is what? They think of it as an emotional reaction, okay? But then we actually have two other categories. We have the physical stresses, and we have good stresses and bad stresses. We call the good stresses are the U stresses, EU stresses, and then the bad ones are the distresses. So in the physical realm, obviously sports would be an exercise, working out. They would be a stress on the physical stress on the body, but they're a good stress. On the other hand, bad posture, slips and falls, sitting all day long in bad postures and so forth, sleeping habits, so forth, can be distresses on the body. So that's the second category. And then we have the third category, which are your chemical stresses. These include things like the stuff in the foods that we just talked about, prescription and over-the-counter drugs that have possibly good effects, but also the downside, the negative effects. Chemicals that we're using and cleaning with that are absorbing into our skin and so forth. Things that we're inhaling, fumes and so forth. So these can have chemical stresses on the body. So if you start to think about who has these physical, chemical, and emotional stresses day in and day out, I think all of us do. So they can have a definite stress effect. We want to try to reduce those as much as possible. A book that I'm coming out with is going to go into this in much more detail, so you can access that through our website. So if you take a look at how we react to stress, basically we have these stress things affecting us every day in the three categories: emotional, physical, and chemical, and the body is constantly trying to adapt to them. So what it has to do, it has to first perceive the stresses through the nervous system, and then it has to adapt to them. Okay, so it's an ongoing process of perception and adaptation of what we're experiencing. And what is the main system in the body that is our interface between what's happening to us and how we perceive and send the messages to adapt to it? Which system do you think that is? A lot of people think, oh, the cardiovascular or the hormone system and so forth, but it's really not. It's your nervous system. Your nervous system is what carries all those messages that allow your body to perceive and adapt to these different stresses. It carries the information, the innate intelligence, your inborn intelligence that knows how to keep you healthy and is constantly striving towards that state of what's called homeostasis or balance. It's the inborn intelligence of the body. It's constantly there, and it's interesting if you look at Deepak Chopra, who's a medical endocrinologist at Chopra Center for Wellbeing in La Jolla, California, says intelligence is more important than the physical matter of the body, because without it, that matter would be formless, undirected, and chaotic. And take a look at these last two words. Again, when we take a look at a system that, when the nervous system is irritated and agitated and signals aren't getting through correctly, it can get to a point to where the system is kind of chaotic, again, undirected. And when you look at hyperactivity and so forth, and these kids are having a hard time sitting in school and being focused, you got to get the nervous system settled down so it transfers these signals appropriately. And the nervous system is housed within the spine. Obviously, the brain's inside the skull. And then we have these 24 intermovable segments down through here that, that protect the spinal cord. And the great thing about all these little segments, it allows us to move and jump and bend and so forth. But in the same aspect of the fact that we can have all these great movements is that the spine can also get out of alignment. And that's called a subluxation. The vertebrae are the bones, and when they get out of alignment, they subluxate. When they subluxate and get out of alignment, what it does, it causes strain and stress on the nerve tissue. And the neuroscientists have shown when you stress nerve tissue, you interfere with the messages. So we start to interfere with the ability of the body to transfer information, perceive and adapt, and also to set up the different stimulation for these neural networks and so forth that we talked about. So what cause subluxations? Basically the same things that they're dealing with are the three categories. The emotional, physical, and chemical stresses on the body can actually cause the body to subluxate. And people go, well, how can an emotion cause the spine to come out of alignment? But if you think about it, when you're really stressed out, where do you feel it? What do you feel tighten up? And almost all the time have done lectures over the years, when I ask that question, people point to their neck or shoulders, and this is what gets all tightened up. Well, all of these muscles are anchored into the spine. So over time, the tightness of those muscles can pull it right out of alignment. So it's really important for us to start to look at these different stresses and find ways that we can start to eliminate them and reduce the stress load as much as possible. Obviously, there's some things here we don't have any control over. We want to try to do the best we can with what we are able to control. And the stress on the spine can actually start in the birth process. And actually, if you look at Dr. Gutmann, he's a medical doctor in Germany, did a study, and the bottom line is that he came up with the fact that about 80% of kids are out of autonomic balance from day one. And what is your autonomic nervous system? It's the system that literally carries all the messages that run everything in the body. And the really important thing about the upper neck, when they either forceps delivery or they grab a hold of the head to get the shoulders out, is that they can actually cause stress in this upper part. And if they affect this one, it's called a cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, V-A-G-U-S, if it gets that vagus nerve and causes interference to it, it can affect down into the heart, lungs, stomach, gallbladder, liver, pancreas, spleen, all the way down into the intestines. So this upper neck area is a crucial signaling point for a lot of different functions in the body and the integration that allows our body to try to perceive and adapt to different stresses and function properly. Interesting, they did a study, it was the University of Chicago Medical School, Department of Hypertension, had chiropractors come in. It was a medical study. They brought in chiropractors, and they had them adjusting the first bone in the neck, what's called the atlas, C1. And basically what they found was that when they were adjusting this and getting the pressure out of that nerve coming down through there, they were seeing huge effects in blood pressure. And the lead medical doctor on that research project was, in his conclusions, made a statement. He said, frankly, we were very amazed at what we thought. We thought we'd see minor changes, but we saw much greater than that. So very important area. Make sure you get your kids checked for that upper area very early in life. So then as we start to go through life and we start to do our sitting and our computer work and looking down at laptops and texting, they call it text neck nowadays, is that we're bending over, these kids are bending over so much they start to straighten out the bones in the neck, and it puts strain on the spinal cord in there, and then all the way down through there we can have misalignment. And remember, if we come back to our concept of Roger Sperry's work, he says that all of this stimulation to the brain comes from the spine, and if we're all bent over and we're misaligned and subluxated, we start to send the bad signals up there, we're not sending the good signals, and the brain is just not going to function as well as it should. Again, our diagram, when the spine is adjusted, it upregulates these different areas, and when it's subluxated, it interferes with them. Okay, so again, we have to move our bodies and keep in movement and do things. And actually, with students, it's interesting. I saw a study the other day where they're talking about what they're trying to move forward to at some of these schools is actually having the kids at standing desks instead of sitting desks, so they're up moving around more, shifting their bodies, stimulating these joint receptors, and so they're moving better, but we also want to make sure they're moving on a properly functioning spine that's not subluxated. So again, when we take a look at this movement, the actual movement and getting these subluxations out of there is opening up the circuits to be able to function at higher levels. So what it does, it allows these children to be able to expand into these neural networks and just open up their system to have a greater and greater capacity and opportunity to learn and explore their world and move into that in a higher functional way. So if we're not, then we are, we're closing down the system to not be able to function at its highest potential. And a lot of times we're losing the potential to be these different neural networks are pruned off, and where these kids are just not going to function as well as they possibly could. Interesting, Nobel Prize winner Arpad Danegi from the Rockefeller Institute made a statement, and he said that that damage to the nervous system can start very early, and that chiropractic care should be started and maintained on a preventative basis very early in life. And this is I believe he was a neurologist, but I know he's a medical doctor. So how do you know if you're subluxated? And the issue is that often we don't, and that's a problem. And why is that? Well, think about this. Have you ever known somebody that felt good, and then all of a sudden they found out they had heart disease, cancer, diabetes? In our society, unfortunately, we're conditioned to think that as long as we feel good, we're okay, and that we have a problem when we feel something or is bad. That's not the way it works. 3 trillion bits of information a second are traveling through the subconscious nervous system that runs our body. Only 50 bits of information a second ever hit the conscious brain. So that's why we can have a lot of interference to our internal function and not even have a clue what's going on. All right? So look at this diagram. There are 3 divisions of the nervous system, 3 primary divisions. The motor system, which runs the muscles, the autonomic, we talked about a few minutes, the organs, glands, and blood vessels, and then we have the sensory system, and part of that is what registers pain, conscious pain and symptoms. And only 10% of the nerves in the body have the ability to carry pain information. The other 90% are running your muscles, your organs, glands, and blood vessels, and so forth. So again, these are non-pain sensitive. You're not going to feel interference to them until they get really bad. By that time, you've got a problem. So do we want to be reactive and wait till things break down and then try to fix them and have to use drugs and surgery? Or we want to try to get healthy from day one so we function more at our optimum potential? It's interesting, a side note of this, we're talking about learning and more cognitive types of processes, but there was a study done, you kids are in sports, there was a study done on the motor system, and what they did when they were taking kids and looking at their reaction time, then they would adjust any subluxations that were in there to clear up the nervous system, particularly to the motor system, and what they found is it increased their reaction time by about 14%, and that's huge in sports. If you think about some of these events, particularly like in the Olympics, where they're won by hundredths of a second, if you had a little bit faster time in there, it would make a difference between you're on the podium or not. So how do we know if there's interference to the part that we don't feel? In our office, we have computer scans we can do. We can actually look at the different parts of the nervous system that you don't feel and do an assessment. So if you're not in our area and you want to go to somebody, check and see if they have the technology that can actually look at these different systems to truly see if there is interference in there, and then be able to track your process over time. Now here's a picture of a person that came in pre-chiropractic on the initial evaluation, and then after 8 weeks of care you can see how the system's really settling down and balancing itself. I find it really unfortunate in our society that a vast majority of people view chiropractic strictly on a back pain model. It's interesting, back in the late 1800s when chiropractic first started, nothing to do with back and neck pain. It was really designed to remove interference to the nervous system so the body could function better and be healthier. And as people started getting adjusted for that reason, they noticed a nice side effect. And the side effects were back and neck pain and headaches were going away. And over the last 110 years, then what's happened is public's perception of chiropractic has switched over to that back pain model and gotten away from the true functional health benefits of what chiropractic or a properly functioning spine can result in. So what I want to do is show you a couple of case histories, and remember that diagram we showed you with the 10% what you feel and the 90% that you don't feel. Okay, just because you don't feel something doesn't mean that there's not interference there. This is a young boy, he was 8 years old, came in, had scoliosis. You can see on the left side of the screen here, and absolutely no pain whatsoever, no symptoms, didn't even know. The parents were patients and just wanted to get him checked and see if there was anything going on. Luckily, we found this early, because if you find it early, you can get them corrected. As is shown here, 6 months later, we had pretty much straightened that out. Then we take a look at what we find a lot are, because of bad posture, sleeping habits, text neck, bending over, looking at computers, laptops, and mobile devices, again, as we discussed earlier, we can start to alter the curve in the neck. So this is what a normal should look like. And what I want to point out here is everything in the brain comes through this little hole in the base of the skull, and it should come out and into the canal, and that canal should come forward. See the line along the second bone in the neck here is that it should go forward. So it comes out, goes forward, down, around, and back. Nice relaxed spinal cord sitting in there, so I can transfer its information without any interference. What happens is that, like this young teenage boy, is that if you look up here, if I was to draw a line along the back of this bone, that second bone right there, it's going backwards, not forward. So as the brainstem and spinal cord come out of the base of the skull, now what it has to do is come forward and then immediately turn and start going backwards. So I did a little drawing on this to kind of give you an idea. Follow the red line. As it comes out, but it immediately has to start to turn and go backwards. We get this kinking effect going on in there. And it's kind of like if you were to remember when you were kids and somebody was spraying you with a hose, what'd you do? You'd run around behind them, grab the hose, and do what with it? You'd kink it, because what's that do? Cuts down the flow. And what you don't want to do is start to cut down the flow here. There's an Alf Brigg out of Sweden. He's a neuroscientist that wrote a book called Mechanical Tension in the Central Nervous System, and he talks about how when you distort the tissues, you mess up the messages. And so if we start to interfere with the messages here, what can we have an effect on? Literally everything down below it, because this area is a key communication center, as we talked about earlier, with that vagus nerve, and all of these millions of nerve fibers coming down through here that come down and exit out can be getting interfered with. So it's really important to get these curves assessed and see if they're there, and then get them out of there. The other thing that happens besides the effects on the nervous system and function is that it starts to put abnormal stress in the joints, and they can wear down over time. So again, this is what our normal looks like. To take an example here of this young man, starts to get misalignment, and misalignment in the spine causes mechanical tension. And it's just like the car tires. When they're out of alignment, over time they wear down too fast. So the same thing in the spine is that over time, this young man got his spine corrected, fortunately, but if it was left like that and wouldn't have been assessed and even known it was there for a period of time, it starts to wear down the joints. We start to get degeneration in the actual discs in there, which can cause huge problems over time. And once the degeneration is there, you can't get that out. You can continue to correct the spine and the alignment, but you can't get the degeneration out. So again, prevention is really the name of the game with this. So then we take a look at the correction process. Here's a before and after to give you an idea. This is a moldable structure. As I said earlier, it can get out of alignment from slips and falls, bad posture, sports, text neck, all these different things. So looking forward and bending forward, or accidents and injuries. So, but the same way you can mold out of place, we can mold it back into place if you do the right things to it. And that's what we specialize in our office for almost 29 years now. So adjustments have positive effects on a host of things in there. When you start to fire those signals back up in the brain and they upregulate things, here's a list of what they do. And relevant to our conversation here, we have movement, thoughts, memory, learning, affect, emotions, which affect behavior, and then also the immune system to fight off bacteria, viruses, cancer, to help the child be healthy so they don't get sick as much, have to stay home and miss class and so forth, and they can stay more focused when they're in class. So sit back and check these testimonials out. It's going to give you an idea about the different things, that results that children can have when they have a properly functioning spine and nervous system. So I think you start to get the point of how valuable a properly functioning nervous system is. And then when you start to add in that plus moving and exercising, the nutrition for fuel for the brain, reducing stress as much as possible, reducing the candida overgrowth, and getting your spine checked again to remove those subluxations, it's huge insofar as the effect it's going to have on these children over time. So hopefully this time period you spent with me, and I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. Obviously you care about your kids, and hopefully the information we have laid out there for you will help get you started in looking at some different aspects of how you can improve these kids' learning and memory capabilities. There's a ton of information on our website. I've got a lot of videos on YouTube. Go in and explore these things. We're here to help. We're as much of an educational institution as we are a healing institution, so please access us. If you have any questions at all about anything I've gone over, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'd be happy to take the time and sit and talk with you. Okay, well, thanks again, and hopefully this has helped.